top graphs, really fantastic as ever. Thank you very much indeed, Lawrence. And I've asked Lawrence to stay with us. He's going to join our panel now. And if I could ask Clare and Anne also to come up. You know, I think Lawrence beautifully set out the challenges as you know, a Prime Minister, we don't actually really know quite, well, in fact, I didn't even know who the Housing Minister was, so there's plenty of uncertainty around. I'm not sure the government does yet either, to be fair. But yes, we have a Prime Minister who very few comments really on the challenge, other than this vow to abolish these, I think it was Stalinist, Marxist, Soviet top-down housing targets. I think it was a Telegraph way of describing it. And she's not going to build on the green belt. So, you know, that's interesting to see how that goes. And as Lawrence was saying, you know, house prices in England at their highest ever level, in real terms, the most unaffordable ever. Rents have been rising, as we saw in your graph, at the fastest rate ever. And housing delivery is going backwards, actually the lowest for 5 years. So, I'm going to join my panel now. Seamlessly walk across here. Very nice to see you all. Thank you very much indeed. So I'm joined by Clare Miller, who is, I'm sure many of you will know, the CEO of Clarion, and by Anne Kavanagh. Anne is CEO at Telford Homes. And Anne, interestingly, we'll come to you first perhaps, because you are fresh to the sector, having worked particularly in Europe, but with a financial background, an investor background. I mean, you've just been watching Lawrence's presentation. What do you make of this sector? What do you feel about things right now?
Well, I would say I'm not new to the sector because I have been investing in the living sector globally for the last 20 years. I guess what I am more new to is a UK focus. And I guess the way I'm looking at what's happening in the living sector is that, you know, we're seeing massive change right across globally, and we're seeing housing challenges globally. But what we have seen is a massive move by the institutions back into this sector. And in the UK, many of the institutions invested in this sector. When I joined the industry in the 80s, they'd all exited. Yeah. And you know, I think any period of change is a period of opportunity. And we have seen over the last 10 years, this sector in Europe has grown tenfold. To Lawrence's point, in this country, the BTR market is still very, very small, very, very immature. On the continent, it has provided stability within the housing markets for a very long time. Mm-hmm. And I think that there will be a lot of change in this country, and I think it's a very interesting time. You know, if I look over the next 10 years, I think it'll be a transformative time for the whole living sector. In what way? Well, because I think the institutional investors are looking at the challenges in the retail sector, challenges in the office sector. If I look at your last chart, you know, where is the land going to come from? You know, I think what we will see is a lot of value destruction. We've already seen it on the high street. A lot of high streets need to be repurposed. And if we're smart as an industry, that could provide a great opportunity for more intergenerational communities. And to the point of, instead of the pony paddocks, it will be, you know, the sites in town. We're also seeing since COVID, you know, the challenge for officers, and, you know, most of us now not spending 5 days a week in the office, the whole occupational demand is changing rapidly. And again, there'll be a lot of repurposing of offices. I think we haven't yet seen the valuations reflecting the ESG requirements that will come in that sector. So the period of change we're going to see is going to be phenomenal. Yes. And that will provide, some challenges, but it will also provide tremendous opportunities. And I think at those moments of inflection, it's a time for reset. It's time to look at how the industry has worked in the past, how it could work in the future, and look at different models from elsewhere, where this sector has been funded, you know, right across the spectrum by the institutional sector and has been professionalised. And we haven't had that in this country.
No. I should have said, do go on to Swapcard. We have got roving microphones, I believe, but you know, it might just be easier if you want to just go on to Swapcard, put your questions for any of our panellists in there. Clare, I wanted to, I think what was interesting about, one of the interesting things about Lawrence's marvellous graphs was that, I mean, they went up, but they also appeared to be coming down again. You know, maybe we're in for a temporary blip. Opportunities is the way Anne describes it, but, you know, the tenants who live in your homes are really staring at a incredibly difficult, certainly, you know, one would hope it's short term, but it may be a very, very difficult period with long-term consequences. How would you assess, having seen all the graphs that we've just seen, how would you assess where the sector is?
Well, there's a desperate need for affordable accommodation in the UK, and the circumstances of the households who live in Clarion homes are significantly different from the households that Lawrence was talking about, you know, those aspirational households looking to get into their first home. To give you an idea, the average household income of a new resident going into a Clarion home is less than £15,000. Their experience of the pandemic was not one in which they were able to work at home and make savings on their travel. Mostly, they're in low-paid employment and employment that required them to get out to work. So they're working in the care sector, they're working in retail, they're working in employment which is not capable of being done from home. So their resources going into an economic crisis, their fallback, if you like, is non-existent. We survey a representative sample of our residents every year, and over 10 years we have tracked the impact on their household income, their health, and what they think about the future for them. And I can tell you that the sentiment coming from my residents at the moment is that things have never been so difficult. And we're just about to go into, you know, it's very nice to hear that inflation may not peak at 20%, it may peak at 10%. But if you are a household with absolutely nothing but income to spend on essentials, that can be devastating. And even if it's a shorter period than we all hope for, it still will have an enormous impact on those residents.
It's been kind of suggested that, you know, the deal that Liz Truss announced just before the royal hiatus kind of answered the problem. Did it?
So we have a new administration, and we have heard things said about energy caps, but we're still waiting to see the full weight of what the government is going to do.
We've got a sort of budget thing happening, haven't we?
We have. And I have to say, the prospect of helping low-income households with their energy costs is a great thing. It's a shame that because of the complexity of the system, the relief has been universal and has gone to households who perhaps need it less than many of the households I'm dealing with. To give you an idea, last week, some residents in a Clarion home capped their own gas because they are so fearful of the bills that are coming in. Now, that's dangerous. It puts other residents at risk.
What does that mean? Sorry, how do you actually do it? What are we talking about? Sorry, I just don't...
So you stop the gas coming into your house so you cannot use it.
Right. So they can't cook?
No.
Their water's cold?
Yeah. And that is because people are so fearful of the bills that are coming their way and so uncertain about how they will pay them.
I mean, I suppose, you know, as we've been discussing, as Lawrence's presentation made so clear, we are, you know, in this rather strange moment, in as much as we've got a new government and new everything pretty much, and because of the death of the Queen, everything kind of got sort of held, just completely stopped. and so we are the first conference after, but, you know, in government, there will be, you know, all those things that they plan to do. We have this financial statement on Friday. You know, are we, you know, perhaps talking without really knowing, or do we already know that some of the fundamentals particularly for poorer residents in social housing are going to be devastating this winter?
I think it's going to be really difficult this winter. Housing associations do two things. We provide affordable accommodation, we look after our residents, and we have to balance the books. It's very nice to see your little chart about developer profit. In my world, there is no profit for many of the things that we do. So we take on projects like regenerating old estates. None of you in the room would do this because there is no commercial return to be had from it. We do it because we are the landlord and we are the presence in a community for decades. And that's what motivates us, making sustainable places. But I think what I'm seeing at the moment is that the households in Clarion homes are going to be so affected over the next 12 to 18 months that it is going to be really very difficult to make those places sustainable without government support and assistance. And that's not just to us building bricks and mortar and new homes, but to residents who have very low incomes and who may need the flexibility of a benefit system to be able to go up and down to compensate for some of these things.
Yeah.
And we saw that during the pandemic. It was great, but I haven't seen any hint that the government is minded to go down that route again.
Well, let's see what happens on that. I'm keen to sort of focus on, obviously there's the immediate, if you like, sort of urgent help that people are going to need just to see us through the winter. But there's also what the sector can do more broadly around the affordability challenge that clearly affects your residents as much as anyone. And I'm interested in your thoughts about how the sector can achieve what it's really not been achieving at the moment. Some of this is a political decision, of course, but actually in terms of genuinely affordable homes. All that talk about build, and we're going to get people back on the housing ladder, and we're going to, you know, actually, we're seeing house prices, and they may be about to stabilise a bit. Maybe that's a good thing for, you know, the younger generation. But actually, they are as unaffordable as they have ever been. 9.1 times the annual, you know, salary, average annual salary to buy a home in England now. In London, you know, it's through the roof. What do you think the sector's challenge and responsibility is in trying to make sure that actually people can afford a secure home, a roof over their head?
It's a huge problem because of the supply side issues. And the reality of that is that the government's moved out of the supply side, supporting the supply side, and they've moved more into trying to work with it. And this is right across Europe, you know, where governments have moved more towards supporting the supply side issue, which in the UK is often through the housing benefits. You look at the bill for the housing benefits, it's just increased massively. But I think it needs a holistic view. And what I've seen on the continent that works well is, and it's probably because on the continent you have a lot of coalitions. I mean, what seems crazy to me in this country is that, sure, we've had a new prime minister. It's actually the same party. None of us should be worrying or thinking about, well, what's going to change?
Well, I mean,
there should be policies that are in place that have got longevity.
Well, we've got a new housing secretary. We've apparently got a new housing minister, although yet to be confirmed. In terms of the prime minister, as Lawrence was saying, we're going to read the runes a bit, but and clearly she was being elected by members of her own party, which means that the way that you sell yourself is going to be slightly different. But the noises are, in a way, anti-development, aren't they? I mean, it's no way are we going to build on the green belt, even though, you know, they seem to have a very curious idea of what the green belt is. You know, all this talk about housing targets. Well, we know what happens if you don't have housing targets of some kind, people just don't build the houses in their area, the planning authorities don't go there.
No, and look, the reality of it is the fact that we're all debating what it means. What I've seen work well elsewhere is that where there's a consistent framework for the private sector to operate within, where you know what the rules are, you know what the framework is, it's consistent, it's measured, and that it has some longevity in it. In an ideal world, it would be supported by different political parties and it would be a cross-party agreement. You then set a framework for 10 or 20 years that the industry can work within. What we see in this country is even within the same party, the power of individuals to flip-flop, and which creates uncertainty. And it doesn't matter, what business you're in, what generally doesn't work well for business is uncertainty, because you're constantly adapting the rules. And so I think that the first thing we need from the government is some certainty and a framework that people can work within. And I think that the other thing I've seen on the continent between the public and the private sector for affordability and providing affordable houses is a much greater sense of partnership, true partnerships where there's trust and honesty, where the private and the public sectors are working very well together, meeting end goals.
How do other countries in Europe view what's happening in the UK? Do they think, they've just got their own, idiosyncrasies, or do they think we're a bit of a basket case?
Look, it varies, and and I think what that translates into is, investment is portable. Global investment is portable.
Exactly.
And so, of course, what we see the outcomes of that in investment flows.
And which way is it going?
Well, look at what's happening with currencies at the moment. So, now some people will find that attractive because at the moment the UK, on some measures, can look very cheap. If you look at the pound against the dollar, we're at an extremely low point. But actually what that shows you is that, the confidence is at a low ebb. Right.
Lawrence, we've got a new housing secretary who we do know who that is. The youngest, I think he's 37. I mean, extraordinary, very, very young man to have that role, one of the youngest cabinet ministers we've ever had, I think. We've got some mysterious person who we may or may not be housing minister. But we do have now a few days when we're going to be, I think, beginning to understand what trustonomics means and what a trust premiership is going to look like. If you were advising her and her housing team, what are the buttons that they really need to be pressing right now to set the train in the right direction?
I think it's as Anne was saying, the sector really thrives on stability and certainty. And if you're making investment decisions that are going to be, you're not looking at a turnaround in 2-3 years. Many of these investment decisions we're making have a cash flow, they've got a return period of 20, 30, 40 years. So you cannot play around with policy sort of willy-nilly. So I think the first thing I'd recommend is to take a break, chill out for a little bit, and actually think before acting. We had Gavin Williamson come to speak to one of our events back in the lockdown period. He was housing minister about 7 housing ministers ago, who said the problem with being Minister of State for Housing is that it's quite an important job, but it's just on a stepping stone in terms of cabinet seniority. And so you get in place and the pressure is on to do something big, to do something impressive, and then somebody notices you and they promote you, and within 6 months you're gone. And as a result, you see Dominic Raab going off to Justice and Deputy Prime Minister and whatever else. I think that's got to change. And we had the situation where housing was a Secretary of State post, and then we've sort of taken it away again. So I think potentially one change I would make there is to make it that primary focus for somebody who's working at a very senior level to ensure that it gets the attention and potentially the right kind of ambitious leadership.
Because, it's a very good point, and you made it in your presentation, actually, about the focus on levelling up. Liz Truss has said, she used the phrase during her campaign and as Prime Minister, so it's not gone away, but might we see a shift in terms of thinking, perhaps towards, if you're really looking for growth, you're probably not going to build houses in Cumbria, you're going to build them in the Cotswolds. And I'm wondering whether we are going to see, well, what do you think is likely to happen?
Potentially, as talking about phrases that have come back or still being used, I think Northern Powerhouse has come up in a few discussions as well, which is interesting, sort of rolling back to that mentality. But I think that's, having a bit more of a strategy about these things, rather than this sort of very ephemeral term, levelling up. I'm not sure anyone ever defined what levelling up was. But at least with Northern Powerhouse, you can say we are concentrating our investment and our strategic development position to say Manchester, Liverpool, these areas, we're going to connect them up, we're going to encourage business investment here, and we're going to develop the homes that we need to support that growth in employment. I think without that joined up thinking and that long-term vision, we're really going to struggle.
So there's a big job, isn't there, for Kwasi Kwarteng on, is it Friday, I think?
Friday's the mini budget, yeah.
Yeah. Is that what it is, a mini budget?
I think they're called,
is it? Well, anyway, whatever it is. Obviously from your residents' point of view, they probably won't be watching, but it will have a massive impact potentially on their future. What will you be hoping to see over the next, not just in the financial statement, but sort of generally in the sort of direction of travel for this new government?
So I would like to see the government supporting housing associations in the work that we do. And that support comes through a number of different things. So supporting us to build, because we are a significant contributor to the number of new builds. Clarion is the biggest housing association in the country. We built 2,200 homes last year. It's a contribution to the overall 300,000 that we need to build. But there are many housing associations contributing to that number and lots of new entrants into our market. So continuing to encourage and support that, I think, is really important. Continuing to understand the experience of our residents is also equally important for an incoming government. And that's not just the role of the housing minister, it is the role of ministers across government. So many of our residents are the essential key workers that keep things going. They need to be supported in order to provide the continuing labour force that they do. Clarion supports 4,000 residents every year into work, and we rely on the government to help us with that. So we've had kickstart programmes. I'm waiting with bated breath to see what will replace that, but that is equally important to the success of neighbourhoods and communities.
And in terms of, I mentioned, he's the Secretary of State for levelling up communities and housing. Is it that way around? Or is it housing and communities? Anyway, whatever it is, housing used to be the first, and now it's sort of moved down below levelling up. How important, these things matter and they don't matter in a sense, but to what extent do you think the government needs to be focusing on the housing bit as the real priority, and levelling up perhaps it's too much of a sort of political idea and not enough in
So for an
concrete
organisation like mine, they're two sides of the same coin.
Right.
Essentially. So we have homes and have been a presence in most of those large northern cities for well over 100 years. And we're continuing to invest. So we have recently bought the car park outside Boddington's Brewery in Manchester. And we're going to...
Sounds like a lovely spot.
Indeed. We're going to be delivering the first affordable homes in the city of Manchester on that scheme. That is really important for the economic wherewithal of that city. And that's the difference that we can bring. We are, of course I want to run a financially viable organisation, but I have a different rationale for why we are in places. And if we can work alongside developers and others to create these projects that provide affordable accommodation, then that's a win-win, not only for cities like Manchester, for the wider local authority area and for the economics of that place.
And I guess, we talked about the importance of certainty and clarity, and I think on the planning side as well, Anne, we've got it's called the Levelling Up White Paper, isn't it? But, all that great conversation that we had on planning before the fatal by-election that killed it politically, that seems to have gone away, and we're still waiting, frankly, for any clarity on the planning framework in which people are going to be operating.
Yeah, and I think, that's such Lawrence's stats, just showed how challenging that is. I mean, planning's such an important part of the process. And, we've all been waiting to see if there will be changes there. But I think you have to take a holistic view of it. If we want to have cities that thrive and are successful and generate economic growth, they need key workers.
Yep.
And, cities have to work. Good cities attract investment. And it's such a framework that's needed for economic growth. And it has to be a holistic approach from the government rather than a siloed approach on one area. If you look at the impact of, housing, what impact it has on people's health, it's major. And, you talk to any business at the moment, we're all working with the war on talent. Yeah. Trying to find attractive, well-qualified staff is a huge issue for most
I want to come on to
businesses.
the supply of labour and other issues in a moment. We do have roving microphones, do we not? Is there a roving? Yes, there's a roving microphone over there. If anyone's got any questions and I'd like to ask them in real life, I'd be really keen. It's been a fascinating discussion so far. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. You had a couple on swap card. Do go to there as well if you'd rather. But is there anybody who's got a burning question or a comment they want to make at this point? Shove your hand up if you do. They're all very shy. It's all that gin. All right. Well, if it comes to you, just throw your arm up, and I will come and find you. Or, as I say, use swap card. Yes, you talked about the shortage of labour. We know that there are huge shortages in both construction and real estate. I mean, they're the highest they've been for many, many years. But we've also got huge supply challenges in terms of raw materials. And in the midst of a cost of living crisis, that means it all adds to that. What will you be hoping to hear from the new Chancellor on Friday that will provide people with just a little bit more confidence about the times ahead?
Well, I think, some of it is, if you look at any survey at the moment, economic confidence is pretty low. And, and then the confidence is feeding through into, consumers, is feeding all the way through the chain. And, we do not see economic growth in an environment where, confidence is at rock bottom.
Yeah.
So I think, the beginning part of seeing any kind of recovery is always seeing the confidence start to turn up.
Yeah.
And at the moment, we all know it's going to be a pretty bleak winter.
Bleak winter. Lawrence, we've had a question. Thank you for this, whoever it was. Anonymous. Anonymous has been very busy, actually, this morning. Will we ever build 300,000 new homes in England in a year? What is the real target and what needs to change to get there? Anyone in the sector knows, and the figure's been repeated time and time again, ministers appear to have been convinced by it, and even prime ministers appear to be convinced by that target. Now it's, Soviet style, Stalinist, Marxist, top-down, targets and all the rest of it. But we still need the houses. We do. And I think it's worth bearing in mind the 300,000 a year target is not something that's specifically about it's not focused enough in a way. It's a figure that economists believe will allow housing affordability to ease without causing any supply shocks. And indeed, if you look at work that's been done more recently, there's some work that's been commissioned by Crisis, I believe. Other researchers are available. That shows that actually the housing need is even greater still. Yeah. But I think fundamentally, when you look at the breakdown, when they show that housing need, that breakdown of what we should be delivering, a massive chunk of that needs to be affordable housing. Yeah. And at the moment, there just is not anywhere near the amount of... we talk about affordable housing, and there's obviously houses for social rent, which is a specific product. But actually, when we're talking about affordability in housing terms, where house prices are in England right now, where house prices are in London right now, it's not just for poorer people in our society. It's for everybody, isn't it? I mean, just housing is unaffordable.
Completely. And if you look at the first-time buyer figures, I think we've got some research out just a month ago showing that the proportion of buyers who needed help from their parents in order to become that first-time buyer, to get that deposit over the line, is the highest it's ever been. So that we're splitting into a market of haves and have-nots, which presumably is not a long-term recipe for success.
Well, let's imagine that Kwasi Kwarteng, accepts that actually housing development is a really good way of getting the growth that he and the Prime Minister are talking about. What are the immediate buttons that you think that they could or should be pressing, perhaps even this week, to actually, get the country building again?
I think one of those points we've already Liz Truss has already suggested, those rules on nutrient neutrality.
But you said that people care about fish, and actually there is an important point there.
And there is this mismatch between, if you look at the level of scrutiny that is applied to planning applications, it is not just about having a sustainability assessment. You've also got to have a bat survey, a newt survey, a fish survey, a nitrate survey. When you add, individually these things make sense, but in their sum total, the amount of work, the amount of effort that's required to get a planning application through and ready for submission is absolutely enormous. And that's before you get to a stage where you've ticked all the boxes, you've complied with the local development plan, the planning officers have said, yes, this is good, it ticked all the boxes, this is perfect, please accept, and the councillors say no, because if I vote to approve this, residents won't like it and they won't vote me back in 4 years' time.
Yeah.
But one of the other aspects to that as well is, it doesn't matter which housing authority you're dealing with in terms of planning permissions, but the other aspect there as well is, what about funding the planning system more?
Yeah, I mean, some of you may even have bumped into it. I did a report for the BBC on housing in Epsom and Ewell, which has one of the poorest records in terms of meeting its obligations under the housing need assessment. And I talked to a developer who had literally, it was a brownfield site by a railway station, and the council had told him, we want to densify, we want it big, we want you to get lots of flats in there. He'd done that. Local residents, they had, I think, 1,000 formal complaints within 2 days. And so they pulled back, he tried again. I mean, the end result was that he had spent, when I met him, £240,000 of his money. That's not buying land, this is just literally on the process, and he'd now walked away. And that, in a way, strikes me as a perfect example of just how blinking difficult it is to do something which is what everyone says we need to do, and in the end, we see projects just simply not happening, and it's a bit of waste ground by a railway station.
But it's a balance, isn't it? Because that's happening the world over. And the challenge there is, how much power do you give to local people and how much power do you give to the developers? And you have to find that balance.
Where do you think it is at the moment?
Well, I see, it's like most systems, it's probably gone too far one way.
Towards local people?
No, I don't think it particularly has. I think that, I think that what we need to have is a framework where there's a discussion for a limited period of time and then decisions get made. One of the difficulties, some of these discussions go on for too long and there's no way of closing them down. Yeah. And, you need local people to have a say. All of us would hate the idea that in their local communities that you don't have a say, but ultimately, you also have to accept that there is a requirement for additional housing, and particularly in the centre of thriving cities, constant change is a reality.
Yeah, yeah. I had a great question from Ian Murray from Cortland. Where's Ian? Where are you? Wave your arm around. Can't see it. He's hiding. Anyway, but thank you for your question. You said, great presentation with some concerning stats. Does the panel think we'll see yields move in support of reaching viability equilibrium, and do they need to? I mean, this is that slide. You said it's not a slide rule kind of slide, but it's a scary slide, I thought.
There was a few slides sort of pointing in this direction. The first one is, I think somebody tweeted the other day quite succinctly, if you want to know what's going to happen to residential markets, look at the lenders. because ultimately it's the lenders who determine what you can afford to do. And with the base rate moving up so rapidly, with interest costs rising so rapidly, that's going to put pressure on things. Particularly, if you consider just a few months ago, you could borrow to buy a residential investment scheme, a rental scheme, and the rates were lower than the yield. That's no longer the case. And so in some cases, something's going to have to change.
We talk about viability, and there's sort of been a lot of in the press recently about affordable housing being the victim of viability reassessment, and actually, what we've been talking here about the importance of genuinely affordable homes, and as your chart suggested, it's going to be the Section 106, it's going to be the Savills stuff that just goes.
Yeah, I don't, it's that fundamental problem of the pie is only so big.
Yeah.
Historically, you've had rising house price growth to bail you out a little bit. That GDV has been increasing, so you can afford to give a bit more to everybody who needs it. But now, in an environment, looking into an environment where those GDVs will not be rising quite so rapidly, then you've got additional obligations with planning regulations, with building regs, with biodiversity net gain. That money's got to come out of somewhere. And ultimately, that viability bit, it tends to be what ends up being squeezed.
Yeah.
I think if one way to help with that potentially is a greater level of clarity about what that contribution is meant to be funding. Because I think with that, tying that more concretely to particular outcomes rather than just it being sort of as some abstract contribution.
Because people do feel out of control. And we were talking about the balance between local people and development, which is so desperately needed in many places. And it is that sense of, we're going to get all this disruption in our lives, a project that and actually, we don't really know whether this is going to be any good.
But some of it also is about local people believing that it is fulfilling a demand in their areas. One of the things that Lawrence mentioned was that, it's not only young people that want to see housing provision being provided. You look at a lot of elderly people are living in houses that are way too big for them.
Yeah.
And some of the challenge to our industry is then providing accommodation throughout a life cycle. Yeah. You look at the growth in student accommodation. One of the greatest opportunities for the industry is to look at housing throughout the life. And there are many opportunities, or could be many opportunities, for more intergenerational housing provision that is also of multi-structures, so that you've got some ownership, some rental, some affordable, all on the same scheme.
And you think mixing them up is a good idea? It
can be a great idea.
In terms of placemaking.
One of the biggest challenges when in my previous firm we set up an impact fund, social impact fund, that was looking at measures from the United Nations Development Goals. One of the biggest challenges across Europe is loneliness, and particularly in older people. If you manage to create, and at Telford Homes we're very into creating, communities. Yeah. It's a really big part of our development, and for many people in this room, community is not just one sector or one age. If you create a really good, vibrant community, it can be intergenerational. And there are some great examples where that's been done.
There's a question actually from Anonymous again, who's very busy this morning. What countries are currently providing adequate housing numbers, and how could the UK replicate this? Well, you've been looking at different markets around Europe. Who's doing it right?
Well, and I think if you sat in any country around Europe, they would all have, different reasons. But Germany is the largest private rented market in Europe,
Should we be thinking about maybe not being the home-owning democracy that the government talks about, and actually thinking about expanding the rental sector and making it high quality?
That would be my view. I think that it's unsustainable. That I think, and also if you look at the stats right across Europe, the rental markets are growing and home ownership is decreasing. I think if you look at the fact that we've had, since the GFC, we've had easy and cheap money. We've seen QE on a scale that we've never seen before. Inevitably, it's led to inflationary trends.
Neil Young, where's Neil Young? Hello, Neil. I'll ask a question for you. It's a good question, an important one. What are the panellists' view on the impact of the Rent Review Act? Clare, do you know about the Rent Review Act? What effect it's going to have?
So can I ask what specifically are you interested in?
My view is a very top-down approach to it.
Yeah. I don't know if we can get a microphone to you, but it's roving. We have a roving microphone. It's nice to see a microphone roving again. Oh, perhaps we're not. Yeah, there it is. Yeah. It doesn't work, but it does rove. No, keep going. It may just need turning on.
I'll try again.
There we are.
Yeah, my view is it's very top-down, and a lot of principles have been talked about with government over the years, whether it needs to be looked at within different market segments, so student, senior living, etc., and whether actually at the moment it's just more of a vote to pleaser.
Right, good. Yes, interesting point.
So, I mean, rents across the private rented sector and rents across the affordable rented sector are in tandem, but also set at very different levels because there are different drivers, essentially. Now, we operate almost exclusively in the social rented sector, and we have a rent regime which government have signed up to, and it's a long-term regime. But we are currently under consultation about rent caps being brought in to the social rented sector. And if that does happen, it breaks the link between the way in which prices are rising and the way in which our income will rise. And that puts housing associations under pressure. There is much debate about whether the government should also have a long-term view about rents in the private rented sector, but they have always shied away from that as being a serious disincentive for those who invest in the private rented sector, and they fear that it will reduce the supply. It's interesting that they don't have the same view about the social rented sector, but there you go. For me, we're entering into such a difficult period, and I think most housing associations want to be responsible. We want to set rents that are affordable for our residents. But if I give you an idea of our starting point, in one London local authority, I'm currently charging rents of £500 a month, and the equivalent private rented property in the same block is £1,700 a month. There's a huge gulf between those two things. And obviously they're targeted at different parts of the market, but nonetheless it shows you the constraints that housing associations are operating under because of the regime that we have.
I mean, just adding on to that, the government's proposing a rent cap for social rented properties that would cap rental growth. I think they've said they prefer 5%, but it could be 7, could be 3.
Yep.
Your costs are still going up.
Yes.
And all of those management contracts, all those build costs, all of those things that you have to do to keep the doors open, keep the lights on, are still going to go up by RPI or CPI +1. So that's a huge challenge that you've got to face with those mismatched incentives.
Can I just add
Please do, yes.
that? Because I think that examples of where we've seen caps generally do result in supply drying up. And so, you know, I think for the government, if they were looking at this holistically, that's not the route to go. It'd be much better to actually look at different measures that can really help create the supply.
Well, let's try and be positive.
Challenge.
We've got 6 minutes, 48 seconds left. So some of these solutions, you know, I suppose we've been having this conversation all the way through, thinking about what's going to happen even in the next few days, because the government is, you know, almost about to sort of launch itself. What would you like to see Kwasi Kwarteng say, or perhaps, you know, the housing team say in the next week or so?
I think the next few days is almost too quick for a long-term solution.
Well, you say that, but it's very urgent.
Important.
And they've been talking about housing. It's the same government, same party in power for 12 years. They should have had an idea by now.
Well, that's what I find so frustrating. I mean, I think, you know, some consistency and a framework to operate in would be helpful. And to understand, you know, what that framework is. There's so much uncertainty about what is going to come. And I think that, that's an issue. I think in the longer term, what we also need to see is, some assistance for using new methods, new materials, and working with the sector to look at, well, what would be helpful? That's what I see happen elsewhere. A much better dialogue between the government and the industry, and about supporting with measures that will help the industry to be more innovative, to look at different ways of doing things. And it should be an opportunity for a reset.
Yeah. Eric Vilaka, is that right? Eric? Hello, Eric. Thanks for I'll read your question out. Very good question. Thank you. Owning your house in the UK is still seen as a measure of success. How can the residential sector change this view to create longevity for the BTR space? I don't know who'd like to answer that. Lawrence, maybe.
I think we've got to be really careful because there's been this trend over the last few years to assume that millennials don't want things, they want experiences. And speaking as a millennial, I'd quite like to experience having some things. So I think to some degree you're not going to get away from that desire to just own some stuff, to build up wealth, to build up that sort of your stash of possessions. But I think part of the problem with the private rented sector in particular is that compared to ownership, your stability of tenure is so much lower. We just need to make renting less crap. And it's what a lot of these professional build-to-rent investors are trying to do, to remove that level of uncertainty, to professionalize that management experience. So you've got a landlord that's actually trying to help you and keep things running, rather than one that, if you're not careful, might try to kick you out without any kind of warning.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got great examples of that. I mean, in one of my previous roles, we managed portfolios across Europe, and the average tenure was 7 years. In Switzerland, there are terrific models for the private rented sector. And what that also results in is that you don't have so much capital tied up in housing. And then
is the model different in Switzerland? I mean, I have no idea, but...
Yeah, so, I mean, the model in Germany, Switzerland, where we're home ownership as a very high percentage, in both Switzerland, Germany, the Nordics, the rented sector, it's the inverse.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at stats globally across the world, fundamentally, it is changing in that less people want to be more mobile. They need to be more mobile to respond to job opportunities. And I think that if you have a sector that's functioning well, that's well managed, well run, it is a credible option. And now I think what we've seen in this country is it often isn't a credible option. And of course, and we've all heard the stories of how people have been treated and the maintenance and the quality. I've had that experience.
It doesn't have a very good reputation, the
children.
private rented sector. And I know BTR is trying to change that, but as Lawrence explained, it's a tiny, tiny part of it still, despite it is growing fast.
Still, it is growing fast, but I think if you look at different models around the world, there's some very good examples of where the pension fund sector is funding the whole housing market.
Really good question from Steve Jackson. Where's Steve? There he is. Hi, Steve. Lots of focus on new build targets, but, good point, 80 to 90% of the buildings we'll be living in the next decade already exist. Should there be more focus here? And I guess, Claire, I mean, implicit in that question is the whole retrofitting arguments about carbon and all the rest of it. So we are going to have to take a long, hard look at our existing properties anyway. Is this an opportunity to think really about the quality beyond just whether or not it's drafty?
Absolutely. So building today for a carbon neutral future is much easier than the prospect of investing in existing homes. I've got homes that were built in the mid-1800s, and the retrofit bill for bringing those up to an acceptable standard is enormous. The Department for Business actually have been fantastic at supporting a retrofit pilot. And Clarion has benefited from it, and we've learned a lot by working alongside government to see what technology we can put into buildings in order to make them more thermally
Robust,
insulated,
yeah.
and easier to heat. And some of my residents who live in those homes have seen their bills cut by about 75%. But the cost of the technology at the moment is very expensive, and it's not something that we could fund on our own. So if the Chancellor was minded to continue with that programme, I would be delighted.
Yeah, we really do have to think about the existing homes as well as the new ones we so desperately need. I can see the clock has almost ticked down. It has been a fascinating, if I have to say slightly perturbing way to start RESi 2022. I think we all need a moment to breathe. So we're going to do that. We're going to have a break now. We're going to see you back here at 11 when we're going to be discussing the metaverse and how it changes everything. I can't wait. See you in about half an hour. Thanks very much.